Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 14th of July. Today we're going to be doing a full front update beginning with Zaporozhye. And yet again we're going to be talking about Pyatykatkhy because the Ukrainians have yet again assaulted the town, and they have not even just focused primarily on the town of Pyatykatkhy itself. They enter the town of Pyatykatkhy and then from there immediately try to attack in the direction of a town that is actually under Russian control, which is Reservists. And so the Ukrainians in pretty small assault groups from various different units from the 10th Army Corps, some of them have mapped out on the map in the area around Pyatykatkhy. And so some of these assault units, they were dropped off around Pyatykatkhy in M113 armored personnel carriers, and they entered the town under a smoke screen. But upon disembarking and trying to assault the town of Zhirbianki directly, they were repulsed by the Russian forces that were entrenched in the area. And for the most part, the units entrenched in this area are from the Russian 19th Division. And so this is just a common theme at this point, where Pyatykatkhy is basically the gray zone. The Russians are entrenched in Zerbianki, and they're firing their artillery onto the advancing Ukrainians that are advancing through this pretty narrow valley that we've talked about for a while now. And then the main Ukrainian forces are in like Kamyanske, Stepave, and then a bit to the east in Orikhiv, and then they're moving in their different units from the 10th Army Corps to continue with these assaults until perhaps one of them ends up being successful. But for now, they have not been able to overrun Russian defenses in Zhirbianki. Moving a bit to the east towards the Orikhiv sector, the situation around Robotyne is still pretty fluid, I would say. I would say that not one side has a firm control over the trend system that I was talking about in my last video. And when I refer to it as a first line, I'm not saying that it's the first Russian line in all of Zaporozhye. I'm talking about this sector specifically. In this sector specifically, and I'm talking about Robotyne, there is a minor trench system, and this is basically the length of it. And it goes back several layers. I showed the footage in the previous video. And so that trench system has been going back and forth over the past 24 hours between Ukrainian assault groups that have been dropped off around Velyka, so that's their forward position, and the Russian troops in this area, and primarily from the 7th Company of the 701st Motor Rifle Regiment. And so for now, it's still changing hands. The Ukrainians do still have a firm control over the nature reserve Velyka, and so they're going to continue with their assaults, but not one side has a solid control over the trench line. A bit to the north, the Ukrainians are beginning to launch some reconnaissance attacks from their positions around this town Bilohirya over here, which they have control over. They're beginning to basically launch assaults towards Novopokrovka, Novoselivke, and Luhivske. And so those assaults have so far been repelled by the Russian forces in this area, specifically the 291st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment, which has been able to push back all of those assault groups. And for now, the front line remains static. Now we're going to talk about a part of the front line which I have seldom discussed, and that's the area around Huliaipole. Huliaipole is a major Ukrainian, basically military hub. Before it was a defensive hub, now I guess you could say it's more of an offensive hub. A lot of resources are shipped in this direction, but it is one of the parts of the Zaporozhye front line that is the most ignored. It's one of the parts that is the least fought over. Really, the last time that we saw any changes in this direction is when the Russians occupied Dorozhnyanka, and that was way before the Ukrainian counteroffensive even started. And since then, neither side has even attempted to conduct any sort of major offensive operations, not even major artillery barrages. It's just been like, cross line artillery duels, but on a much lesser extent than other parts of the front, like Orikhiv or Pyatykatkhy. But now we've finally seen the Russians go on the offensive in this area, and it has caught the Ukrainian forces in this area by surprise, because this is the area where you least expect an attack from either side, really, because neither side really has that many resources in this direction. The Russians have most of the resources aimed at trying to defend, so them going on the attack in this direction is quite interesting. The Russian forces centered around the town of Marfapil, they advanced through some of the forest belts in this area that I'm going to map out with this line over here. they were able to quickly secure them because the Ukrainians were caught off guard, and they made it all the way to the areas adjacent to this reservoir over here that you can see. So the reservoir is now the dividing line between the Russian and the Ukrainian forces. And the aim for the Russians is to reach the town of Chervone, which Ukraine still has control over, although I'm not sure how many troops they have in the area. They probably do have some units from the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade, which is one of the units stationed around Maryinka. Maryinka is one of the larger Ukrainian hubs of defense in this area, and it has been subject to a pretty heavy Russian artillery strike and bombardment over the past 24 hours. Also, Chervane has, I'm not sure about Huliaipole though, but generally the Russian movements in this area would indicate that they're trying to shape the battlefield in a way where they'd have, pretty good positions to the east of Huliaipole, which could either dissuade the Ukrainians from an attack or just shape the battlefield in the future for potential Russian assaults towards Huliaipole. Also, it could cut off some of the supply lines that sort of branch out from Huliaipole. You could see this road over here and how it makes its way to Malinivka. If the Russians were successful in advancing, say, and I'm not saying they will be successful, I'm just bringing up the scenario. Let's say they advanced 3 miles, which is a lot in the context of Zaporozhye, but either way, the distance between the front line and this road over here that connects Huliaipole, again, major node of transportation and equipment, to Malinivka, an important town on the front line, it's only 3 miles. And so the Russians, they do have an incentive to cut it off. And there's plenty of other roads that branch out from Huliaipole. And so, from the Russian perspective, this might be a good target to perhaps maybe not take over because that's basically a bridge too far, but at least to put more pressure on, especially when all eyes are on other parts of the front line. Let's move on now to the Donetsk direction around Maryinka, where we do have some pretty interesting updates. Before we get to that, let's actually quickly review the situation around Velyka Novosilka. And so in this area, I don't have much of a change of the front lines, but we do have new Ukrainian offensive activities in the direction of Pyotnya, specifically from the 36th Marine Brigade, which is one of these units stationed over here. I have them marked over here, or that's 35th. 36th is also around here, this unit, and they're the infantry group that's advancing in this direction, and they're being covered by artillery from the 72nd Brigade, which is a Ukrainian unit which has most of its resources centered around the Vuhledar front. And so now the Ukrainians have been able to fully solidify control over the nature reserve to the north of Prutne, and they are trying to enter the town through this valley over here where you do have a bit of, two parallel forest lines that run all the way into Prutne. And so you can see how they're going to dismount infantry, small groups, and they're going to make their way through the line. And their goal is to enter Prutne from the northwestern corner and try to take it over from that direction. That's their goal at the moment, but we haven't seen any progress just yet, although I do expect some in the near future. Then in Stormayorsk, the Ukrainians also did attempt an attack, and this time from the 35th Marine Brigade. Again, we just clicked on them before, this unit over here, and the 128th Territorial Defense Brigade, which is this Ukrainian unit, which is from Dnipro, I believe, yeah. And so they launched their attack with support from 60 millimeter M224 mortars. They attacked using their new positions, which they secured to the northwest of Stormayorsk after they pushed the Russians out of some key strong points, firing positions, forest belts, and they tried attacking Stormayorsk from the northwestern corner, but so far all attempts have been repulsed by the Russians. So that's it for this part of the front line. Let's go to Maryinka, this time for real. So in Maryinka, I think we did talk about this part of Maryinka in a previous video. I think this was before the counteroffensive when the Russians were trying to shape the battlefield in a way which would be advantageous for them in the Maryinka sector. The Russians took control of this Ukrainian stronghold called the Menagerie. That's what the Russians call it. And so this was an extremely difficult endeavor. It took them months to actually overrun the Ukrainian position, secure the high ground, secure all of these concrete barriers, trenches, also underground passageways. They were able for a certain period of time, maybe about a month, to secure this area. But it seems like in the last week or so, the Ukrainians have conducted a counterattack of their own in this direction and have retaken the entirety of the menagerie. And having control of this strong point is extremely important when you consider the local topography and geography. So the Ukrainians having this very strong forward position, which is reinforced by resupply through underground passageways, so they don't have to worry about being fired upon by shelling as Ukrainian forces run across open fields to supply them. They actually have underground passageways from different towns closer to the rear, like Paraskovivka, Novomikhailivka, Konstantinivka, and from there, that's where the forward positions and forward troops receive resupply. And so they're able to hold out over here. They have machine gun nests. They have snipers. They have ATGMs. They have basically everything that you need in order to stay fortified and prevent attacks across really a wide perimeter. So if the Russians, for instance, were to try to attack in the direction of Pobieda, then they would have to worry about Ukrainian forces firing at them from the south, so that their southern flank would be, under dubious circumstances. It would be under pretty dubious control. And then an assault on Novomikhailivka head on would be extremely difficult because you'd have to get through the menagerie first. And even from the southern flank, it would be difficult to attack it because the Ukrainian forces, they could turn in a certain direction and fire upon the Russian forces that are advancing. So it gives this sort of local domination, especially given the fact that it is on high ground. And the Ukrainians do have control over it. The Russians are trying to counterattack in this direction. From all indications, we have the Russians have so far failed at retaking the menagerie, so it is still under solid Ukrainian control, which will allow them to continue to hold out on some of these forward towns that the Ukrainians have been holding on to really for months now, despite constant Russian pressure both on the ground and through artillery strikes. And it would also help secure some of the supply lines that are connecting Novomikhailivka, Zapovieda, into what remains of Maryinka, because most of Maryinka is under Russian control, but you do have some Ukrainian holdouts from the 79th Air Assault Brigade in the western part of the town. Now, moving on to Avdiivka, around Severonoye, in this area, the Russians, as we said before, were able to counterattack because originally the Ukrainians launched assaults towards this bush line over here. The Russians repulsed it and then went on an attack on their own. Advanced. Let's look at the distances actually. They advanced about 1.7 miles at most in the direction of Severonoye, and they have been unable to take the town yet. And now what we're seeing from the most recent reports is that the Ukrainians are trying to conduct their own counterattacks to push the Russians out of their new acquired positions, but so far nothing has really manifested in that direction. A bit to the north, we have the 53rd Brigade. 53rd Brigade, I mark them as around this town, Novoselivske. Well, there's multiple different battalions in that unit, and some of them may be around the northern flank of Avdiivka. And so the 53rd Brigade, they have conducted attacks against Russian positions around Krasnohorivka. And there's multiple different axes from which they attack. They attacked from the north, trying to cross the rail line and the two adjacent bush lines that Russians have as their forward position in this area. And they also tried assaulting Krasnohorivka head on. And some of them were probably based out of Avdiivka originally as they attacked from the, this southwestern side towards Krasnohorivka. And so you could see how this was sort of a semicircle attack from multiple different directions. But so far, the Russian line has not broken. The Russians in their area, they're defending around the Krasnohorivka, and they do want to keep control of this town because it is an important stepping stone for the Russians if they ever want to cut off supplies into Avdiivka and create the necessary conditions in order to encircle it. And that's also why Ukraine's attacking it, because they want to ensure that Avdiivka is in a stable situation for as long as possible. Now, moving to the north a little bit, I did make a minor adjustment to the Klishivka front just to indicate that the Russians do have a bit more control over some of the fields adjacent to this local road. And so this means that Russians do share a portion of the heights that overlook Klishivka, which will make it easier for them to defend the town itself. But no new updates besides that. If we go to the north, a lot to the north, we're going to go to Novoselivske, which is one of the more interesting parts of the front line right now. And I will just say that there's some ambiguity about the situation, which is why I'm saying that Russia's in the process of capturing it, not that they have fully captured it, because I don't know that for sure. I do know, though, that on the morning of July 13th, the Russian forces, they did not launch a head-on assault towards Novoselivske, but they launched attacks, parallel attacks, all along the southern flank of Novoselivske, trying to fully secure certain forest belts that are on the southern flank and are also on higher elevated ground compared to like the Ukrainian positions in Stelmakivka and the Russian positions in Kuzhamivka. So that was going on throughout the entirety of the morning of the 13th, and there were some very heavy fights. The Ukrainians trying their best to hold on to it because they knew that if the Russians took over, then they would be flanked from the south within Novoselivske, their forward position. So the Russians basically got control over this general rectangle earlier in the day. And what we're receiving in terms of reports from pro-Russia sources, so obviously take it with a grain of salt, is that the Russians have been able to fully secure the town of Novoselivske. From what I've been seeing, the attack really came head on, in that the Russians just crossed over the rail line and from there, block by block, occupied the entire town. I don't know for certain if they fully took it over because, the nature with these sort of battles is that you don't take over an entire town in a day. You got to clear it out, and it's a pretty lengthy process, even for a small town like Novoselivske. Each corner of the town was probably mined and has fighters lurking everywhere. So I don't know if that's true, but I do know for certain that the Russians have been able to at least advance a couple of blocks. So I'm putting it for now a cautious front line through the middle of the town. But in all likelihood, the Ukrainian units from 22nd Motorized Infantry Battalion have been forced to withdraw. They may not even be 90, because they're in 92nd Brigade, they may not even be around Novoselivske anymore. The primary units that's defending Novoselivske now is the 32nd Mechanized Brigade. As we said in previous videos, the 92nd Brigade is being moved from the Svatove front towards Rozdolivka to help us out towards Yakovlivka, and they're being replaced by the 32nd Mechanized Brigade. And so as the Russians have been advancing through Novoselivske, the main unit involved in shelling those advancing forces has been the 32nd Brigade, which has received NATO training. It's a newly formed unit from this year. And so that's it for Svatove. Now, one last thing before I end the video that I think is very important to mention is that really a couple of hours ago, on the 13th of July, President Joe Biden signed this order that activated 3,000 reserve troops to be ready for deployment. So what this means is that they are not going to be automatically deployed, all those 3,000 men, but that they have the potential to be deployed whenever the decision is made by Lloyd Austin and the Department of Defense. So they'll be within that pool, which will immediately be sent when the Department of Defense views it as being the right move. And so this is all a part of America's Operation Atlantic Resolve, which is this, American contingency operation, which was launched in 2014 after Russia took Crimea. Basically, it's this operation that America sends different American troops and equipment to different parts of the Eastern European NATO countries, Poland, Lithuania, all these countries that are near Russia, and also send aid to Ukraine, obviously. So it's a part of that general operation. And so the 3,000 troops, if they're to be sent to the Eastern European countries, which I'm sure they will at some point, they will be joining about 100,000 American troops that are stationed all across Europe. So this is not just Eastern Europe. There's 100,000 American troops in all of these NATO countries in Europe, including Germany, France. Germany, I'd say, probably has the most out of Western Europe in all likelihood. And then more so in Eastern Europe, you have a huge amount of American forces in Poland, and then to a lesser extent in countries like Lithuania. And so what I do find interesting is that we don't know which specific units of American forces will be moved in. I don't know how that system's going to work, but once we do get more information about the American units that are activated and the American units that are operating on the Polish-Ukrainian border, then I will certainly find those units and I will map them on and tell you guys all about it because that is extremely interesting. And one last thing is that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, America has deployed an additional 20,000 troops along Eastern Europe, basically. So, that's not a huge number. It's more so about providing additional security, and in order to reaffirm the relationship between America and Eastern Europe, it's not going to be enough to defend in the case that World War III broke out. Of course, it's more so a power projection, role, in my opinion, unless America would send hundreds of thousands of troops. That would be a totally different situation. But for now, we're only seeing very small portions, like 3,000 at most, which will not make any sort of qualitative difference on the ground itself, at least for now. But we're gonna have to wait and see what ends up manifesting. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.